what does a theatrical hit look like in the modern film landscape? Gone are the days of the mid-budget studio film that dominated the 90s and early 2000s. In a pre-streaming Hollywood, there was a more adventurous moviegoer who would head to their local multiplex, look up at a light, bright litany of titles that sounded vaguely familiar from the newspaper or an episode of Siskel and Ebert at the movies, and they'd take a shot with little more than a gut instinct. In this culture of widespread and frequent moviegoing, there was ample opportunity to see a range of stuff. Sure, maybe everyone at work is talking about this movie where a kid sees dead people ushered around by Bruce Willis. I don't know, and you want to be in on that conversation. But maybe you also see Dark City on a whim because you're curious about this dreary noir seemingly indebted to Fritz Lang, and you're surrounded by people with a similar curiosity who leave the theater thinking, yeah, that was kind of weird, but I'm glad I experienced it. Fast forward to 2024, and the world has changed. Now, don't get me wrong, there are great titles released every year bolstered by newer studios like A24 or Neon, willing to take idiosyncratic swings on auteur filmmakers whose work exists outside of readily identifiable audience appetites. But even the more visible titles like Hereditary, X, Titan command a minuscule fraction of the box office films like that used to, with major studios behind them. The thing is that audiences have grown to expect that these films will be available from one of their many streaming subscriptions in a few months, which minimizes a lot of the urgency once felt to see a film during its theatrical window, lest you experience the FOMO of not knowing what the happens in The Sixth Sense beyond what your loudest coworker has repeated in detail in the break room. These days, for a movie to be a probable hit from a studio standpoint, with, a few exceptions, we're talking comic book properties, reboots of pre-existing franchises, and YA novels with a feral readership eager to see their favorite Instagram influencer build in the third position. Sure, horror also performs well, but the larger budget titles tend to be tied to existing franchises or box office tested filmmakers, and the weirder stuff follows a risk-averse investment, often in the sub $5 million range. But what happens when a film that, by all dependable studio metrics, should repel and frighten the sensibilities of the average moviegoer, but overperforms and becomes a certifiable box office hit? How do we make sense of that? The Substance had lived a very strange life before it saw its first festival audience. The film was originally financed for a reported $17.5 million by Universal, coming off of filmmaker Coralie Fargeat's film Revenge, a conventional rape revenge thriller on its surface that was electrified by its extreme violence and female POV that inverted the traditional gaze in favor of something more volatile and contemporary. However, whatever excitement the studio had about backing her aggressive body horror follow-up faded almost immediately when executives saw the film in post. One can only speculate on the conversation that transpired, but it's not hard to imagine a studio executive fearful of losing their job watching the film that I saw and not freaking the fuck out. It's a film about an aging star whose cultural prescribed value is in decline, causing her to take part in an experimental trial that violently births a younger, more beautiful version of herself from a spine-long gash in her back. From there, the balance between the older and younger versions of herself falls out of phase, causing her body to rot exponentially as her hatred of the younger self grows. It is an insane idea for a movie, and I'm not sure what about The Substance made sense to the studio at a script stage, though not after Fargeat delivered the film. But a shift in either studio leadership of the film marketplace caused the studio to panic and screen the film they deemed unreleasable to other potential buyers. This wasn't going straight to Peacock. They needed to get rid of it. Enter MUBI, an independent streaming service that has recently entered the production and distribution landscape. They tend to license pre-existing titles for their curated streaming service, but they occasionally buy smaller films at market as MUBI exclusives. But nothing like The Substance, partly because there really aren't any recent titles like The Substance, and what may have seemed like a huge risk for the small company, particularly given Universal's utter lack of faith in the finished product, has turned out to be MUBI's greatest success to date. The thing MUBI saw that Universal fundamentally failed to see is a general audience willing to engage with the grotesque when it speaks to something primal and universally relatable, the fraught relationship with the self under the hyperbolic pressures of capitalism. And you'll have to pardon the cute wordplay here, but I can't think of the last time a box office gross like this has followed a film so gross. You might point to the recent success of Terrifier 3, but there's a precedent for a violent slasher franchise successfully capitalizing on an existing genre audience. This is a film about women driven to horrifying and visceral madness by the absurdity of modern beauty standards. That's insane. This is arguably the only film this decade outside of Barbarian to genuinely deliver on its alleged shock factor. Coralie Fargeat's unrelentingly demented satire on female self-hatred perpetuated by the objectifying gaze of a chauvinist patriarchy is brutally weaponized against us as these ageist, unrealistic beauty standards are twisted, tangled, and pulled together, revealing a monster of our own creation. And if you take a step back, you can start to see why this film might resonate for an audience that wouldn't typically turn out for a film wherein bodily orifices ooze and birth globs of only vaguely recognizable bodily material. It is frankly disgusting, but it's also pretty fucking awesome. And there is ultimately catharsis in the idea that the lengths we go to, the products we buy, the operations we push ourselves into debt to pursue, all for the absurd goal of preserving our youth and freezing the present moment, are just that. Absurd. If you push yourself to achieve this impossibility, you will not only be despondent in your failure, but you'll also lose out on the joy of the present. This core humanity, I will argue, is why The Substance has become such a cultural phenomenon that genuinely lives up to and even surpasses the hype it received by critics coming out of its initial premiere. I think this movie is an instant classic and a compelling case for the commercial viability of body horror in the modern era. Bodies. We all have them, and maybe that sucks, but there's no way around it, and any attempts to circumvent this reality will result in, well, we'll get there soon enough. But first, this video is brought to you by our Discord server. Yes, this is going to be a quick plug to join our Discord, the FilmSpeak Discord. We're having a lot of great conversations in there regarding film, television, Q&As about the production of these videos or anything you really want to talk about. I give feedback on thumbnails if you're working on that. I do little teases for some of the upcoming videos, and we're just building a fantastic community there of fellow film lovers, and yeah, hope to see you in there. All of the substances ideas are elegantly embodied by its protagonist, Elizabeth Sparkle, played by an incredible Demi Moore, arguably her greatest performance ever. As The Substance opens following a very funny bookend shot of a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame as it endures footsteps, seasons, and the splatter of street food, we see that Elizabeth is aging quite gracefully from A-list star into the host of a fitness program that preaches being the best version of yourself. To a layperson, it seems like an ideal existence for a one-time star. This, however, quickly fades when Elizabeth is forced to use the stall in a men's room, when the producer of the show, played by Dennis Quaid, enters the bathroom, stares right into a fisheye lens, emphasizing his very clogged pores to nauseating effect, and begins to spew a misogynistic tirade into his phone. He laughs maniacally as he explains that Sparkle is too old and they need to find a hot young star to replace her. The visual dialectic contrasting this conversation with the way the camera photographs Quaid in intentionally disgusting close-up gives you the film's POV right out of the gate. There is a double standard and an impossible contrast between the patriarchal expectations of the world and the realities of the human body. She hosts a show about being the best version of yourself, but the producer of the show says that no woman aged 50 can be their best version. At this point, a series of circumstances lead her to procuring The Substance, an experimental intravenous drug that will birth a younger, more beautiful version of the self, but one that comes with a few caveats. Firstly, your body essentially explodes to release the second body. Secondly, when one body is in control, the other lies vacant in a catatonic state for, and this is important, no more than 7 days before the self must be transferred between bodies in order to regenerate the preserving fluid. If one body remains in control for even minutes longer than allocated, the other body begins to rot, thus initiating a push and pull between the vigor and opportunity of youth and the desperate desire for self-preservation that comes with age. This is essentially everything you need to know about the plot of the film, because the substance is less a vehicle for story than a horrific and hilarious Rube Goldberg contraption dripping with viscera and unidentifiable bodily fluids. This desire to keep the plot light in favor of character and theme is a big part of why the substance works as well as it does. To distract an audience with undue story would give them the opportunity to live in a more analytical headspace, which is not where Fargeat wants you to be. She wants you to be in your body, feeling the push and pull, the nausea, the symphony of internal feeling the film intends to evoke. Now, before I go any further, I want to be very clear on this so that I'm not misunderstood. While I think there is something universal in the substance, in the self-loathing and fraught internal conflict that comes with aging out of the most youthful self, it is important to state that this movie explores that idea within the explicit framework of womanhood. I'm not minimizing the experiences of my fellow men, but the pressures that women face in Western society, particularly as it relates to age and beauty standards, is completely insane if you take even a half step back. There are entire industries built on expensive cosmetics, clothes, pharmaceuticals, elective surgery, all sustained by preserving unrealistic standards of beauty. But we know this. It's nothing new. It's been around for years, and because these cultural values have become so normalized, it's hard to make an impactful statement in cinematic form by just demonstrating that with normal, recognizable bodies. The substance uses its body horror and its hyperbolic contrasts between beauty and grotesquerie to give physical shape to the way we feel inside. Sue's body is adjusted with a combination of CG and doubling to the point where it's almost entirely desexualized and rendered uncanny. Sure, you're seeing a naked woman on screen, but Fargeat's POV as a woman, in the very specific cinematography and VFX choices she makes, refuse the conventional desire of the male gaze and show the audience how absurd it is to interpolate a viewer in this leering perspective. Instead, there's something almost alien about the way she depicts beauty that feels like a visual representation of the envy a person feels inside thinking of a more beautiful person than themselves. In contrast, the film's ugliness is pretty hard to locate in Demi Moore, who is an ageless icon of Hollywood, which is why the substance transforms her body into something utterly grotesque. This wonder of practical effects is a fucking horrifying mass of skin, heads, teeth, orifice, and drips the nastiest goo you've ever seen from every opening. In the same way that Sue's is not a recognizable beauty, this is not a recognizable ugly. It is the physical manifestation of self-hatred and loathing that renders the body dysmorphia of the mind's eye in absurd human form. By representing Elizabeth's complex interiority visually, we see our own. In addition to its characters, the challenges of societal expectations and womanhood are reflected in Elizabeth's environment. Standing in the middle of her loft, she has one of two views: a giant portrait of herself as the icon Elizabeth Sparkle, or a billboard of Sue, the avatar she believed would be a solution to her problems but now haunts her in its uncanny distance from her present self. She's suspended between a past she can no longer access and a societal ideal she can only attain by proxy. In this limbo, she's incapable of finding joy or contentment in the present because the only paths offered her by society are literally impossible to pursue. Even if she's able to look away from these two massive advertisements, she's confronted by a television playing Sue's show or any other reminder of a youth that has passed her by. The film is an indictment of image making and advertising that sells its audience self-hatred. In The Substance, this is particularly potent because Elizabeth is seeing images of herself, but any audience member can relate to the better life promised to them by any number of products or services that only really serve to make their executives more rich. The repetition of workout videos in the film mirrors the repetition of its structure. The advertisements aren't selling you the results so much as they are selling you the sex symbol at its center. The results are literally impossible to achieve, but they continue to dangle the carrot because they know no matter how improbable, the desire to attain the impossible airbrushed physique they see on screen is a wishful thinking that exists beyond the rational mind. It's something the consumer desperately wants that not only dehumanizes the instructor, but it preys upon the insecurities of a normal, everyday woman. Perfection is unattainable. It doesn't exist. The best thing you can do is try to age as gracefully as you can. Feel confident in yourself and be comfortable in your own skin, knowing that we're all subject to the same forces of aging and gravity. For Elizabeth, this acceptance is impossible because she's constantly fed unreasonable expectations as a vocational hazard. She will always be the subject of a leering cultural gaze that feigns shock when a movie star who was once 25 is suddenly 50. It is definitionally stupid, and yet it is a reality for women and exponentially more so for those in a position of public visibility. Alright, let's talk about some of the images in the film. The Substance is viscerally invasive, like to the highest degree. Sometimes these invasions are comedic. Dennis Quaid's aforementioned pores, Dennis Quaid's wet lips slapping shrimp tails in one of the film's most disturbing close-ups, like, god damn it, it's so gross. Or the moment a globular breast connected to an optic nerve slips out of one of Monstro Alyssa Sue's many holes. Look, if The Substance didn't make you barf, my hope is that this video will. That's cinema, baby. But these invasions can also be viscerally off-putting and elicit extreme bodily reactions from the audience. For example, Fargeat reveals in close-ups of injections, like if you have an issue with needles, you're probably gonna fucking vomit at this thing. Like the amount of injections in this movie. Every time Elizabeth and Sue switch, they have to inject themselves with a stabilizer, and it's gross and confrontational from the start, but becomes increasingly nasty as it goes on. Elizabeth and Sue have bloody, knocked down, drag out fights in the loft. Their bodies are dragged across the floor, hurled through glass, and pummeled into pulp. Every time the body presents a new lump or abnormality, the film hyper-focuses on these changes, creating extreme discomfort for the viewer. The lengths to which the film goes to inflict this bodily harm onto its characters is relentless, but it has a purpose. And that's why it's resonating with audiences. It represents the real-world barrage of cosmetic bodily harm and the insatiable desire to conform to an unrealistic image. To continue to try to return to one's youth when the body is ultimately unable is akin to self-abuse. One too many chemical peels will burn your face off, but even if you're successful in transforming yourself, what's left? Is Sue Elizabeth, or is she something else, an embodiment of a hollow societal construct? When Sue begins to break the rules and spend more time in her body, she has to harvest stabilizing fluid from Elizabeth, which creates an oozing infected wound that the camera lingers on without remorse. This injection site darkens and gushes and represents the evident harm that we often ignore for momentary relief. Even when we're armed with the knowledge of the negative side effects and irreversible damage taking something like The Substance could do, many women, even insecure men as we see in Elizabeth's reunion with the man who first introduced her to the drug, seriously consider taking it for their own vanity, to feel comfortable and desirable in their own skin again. When Elizabeth has the opportunity to cut herself off from The Substance and own the small amount of physical deterioration, she can't help but continue until it's too late. What initially began as an attempt to live the best version of herself has created a jealous and vindictive relationship that culminates in violence, but she still can't cut it. It's an addiction, and it's part of what makes Elizabeth such a remarkably sympathetic character in this film. You feel for her. The scene where she's trying to get ready and she looks gorgeous, but is still just not quite happy with how her hair's falling, how her makeup looks, feels she's inadequate to go out in public, to go on this date. Oh my gosh, the tension, you feel it. You feel the self-destruction going underneath the surface that Elizabeth simply cannot rid herself of. Now, it's important to state that the film doesn't come down in binary opposition to procedures or cosmetics that people use to help themselves feel more confident in their own skin. No, not at all. I mean, instead, it treats these habits as a sort of fatal capitalist addiction that will kill you if you lack the baseline of self-esteem and self-respect to protect yourself while tending to your image. These supplements will only amplify the pre-existing relationship with the self, which, for most people, is complicated. But I also don't think the film is judgmental of that complicated relationship and fear of aging. If anything, I think it hopes to remind its audience that these are feelings we all wrestle with. In many ways, The Substance is a film about the impossibility of pleasing others or appealing to unrealistic standards. If we find all of our time clamoring to return to an earlier state, we do so at the expense of enjoying the present. It's no surprise that this message is resonating with an audience, because this positive reading encourages a viewer to chill out a bit and stop worrying about chasing an impossible ideal. It's cool that MUBI saw this and took a flyer on a risky movie that turned out to be one of the best of the year. What's even cooler is that it's a movie this nasty, this unapologetic, this horrific, and also this funny. This film is fucking hilarious. I mean, in the darkest sense of comedy, but truly, I mean, the lengths that it goes to just keep repeating the same steps and just the way it drags on and goes to these insane extreme lengths. God, I bless you, Coralie Fargeat. You just, you get it. So maybe the way to make a hit movie is not to chase an illusory industry mandate of broad audience appeal. Maybe the way to make a hit movie is to acknowledge that maybe we're all a little gross by societal standards. Maybe we're all a little human. Maybe, just maybe, what we learn from The Substance is that honest humanity, that's what audiences really want.